Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk with Wajat Lee for Left Hook Substack, where I invite a subject matter expert to break down one or more than one big question or questions in 30 minutes or less. And today I have a very fancy Harvard Law Professor Mark Tushnet. He has a fantastic book out called Who Am I to Judge? Judicial Craft versus Constitutional Theory. He's one of the country's most astute constitutional scholars, observers of the Supreme Court. He was a clerk, folks, for Justice Thurgood Marshall. He specializes in constitutional law and theory, including comparative constitutional law. And what I want, oh, there you go. 1 second. There you go. That was the alarm clock telling us that it's time to do this interview. But I wanted to ask him today, to speaking about the Supreme Court, asking him about the judicial theory of originalism and how the conservative theory of originalism, whether or not it is justification for authoritarian rule. Professor Tushnet, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. So I'm happy to talk about originalism. I would frame the question a little differently. It's not that originalism is somehow intrinsically associated with authoritarianism, but rather it's such a pliable approach to constitutional interpretation that it could be used for actually almost anything. Actually, I once wrote that it could be used to advance progressive ends. Currently, of course, the people who are the most prominent originalists call themselves conservatives, and conservatism today is tending in an authoritarian direction. And so the outcomes that originalist conservatives favor are likely to tend towards authoritarianism. But again, I want to stress that's not intrinsic to originalism. The real problem with originalism is that it lets them, they say it keeps them from doing what what their political predispositions are. But actually, in practice, it lets them forward their political predispositions while pretending that they're not.
Can we, for the people, I'm still a recovering attorney, still licensed, haven't practiced in a long time, but let's take it a step back, right? Because, to you and me, we know what originalism is, but for the layperson, can you break down this theory that has been advocated and advanced, not just by the current Supreme Court majority, but, even Scalia? Like they keep saying they're originalists. What does that mean?
Yeah, so there's a history to what originalism is, and I'll just describe where we are now, and then we can go back over the history if people want to. So currently, the people who describe themselves as originalists say what they are trying to do is to find out what the words of the Constitution were understood to mean by most of the people at the time they were written into the Constitution. For our purposes, 1789 or 1791. So originalism, it's called original public meaning, original public understanding, originalism. What did the public understand the term due process of law to mean when it was written into the Constitution in 1791 and then rewritten in 1868, written in again? What did the people, most of the people, many people understand the words to mean?
And someone might say that and say, well, I'm not a scholar, but the founding fathers had a few problems, namely 51% of the population couldn't vote, women. Labor laws, we didn't have them there. Abortion rights, that wasn't there, right? Black people were considered not fully human. So, we have the Constitution, but then we have the amendments, and it's a type of fluidity that exists that has allowed us to advance and progress as a society. This comes and then into conflict with what I think what originalism has become is to me, it doesn't seem like they really care much about the original foundation of the Constitution. But I said this to you right before we pressed record. To me, it seems like Play-Doh of a theory. They just kind of use it for what they want.
Well, one of the difficulties with contemporary originalism is that there are a lot of varieties or flavors, as I sometimes call it. And, what originalists do, what people who call themselves originalists do, is, they go to the ice cream store and pick out the flavor that they want that day. And what they want is to advance the conservative agenda of the moment. And so if one flavor won't get them what they want, they'll pick another flavor. And they, because these are all varieties of originalism, like varieties of ice cream, they can say, well, yeah, we're still shopping at the same ice cream store, but they're doing very different things opportunistically, or as other people call it, selectively. And so their account that they're not, that they're objectively trying to understand what the Constitution meant, that just is not an accurate account of their own behavior.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to know that the conservatives oftentimes accused anyone who's not conservative or Republican of being judicial activist. But isn't it clear? I mean, for me, it's clear that what the conservative majority is doing is judicial activism, right? What they can accomplish through Congress or through elections, they're doing through the bench. For example, Dobbs.
Yeah. So, the term activism never was terribly helpful from a scholar's point of view. Basically, when you said a judge was an activist, what you were saying is you didn't like what they were doing. And part of the history of originalism is that it was a way of providing a label to decisions that previously had been called activist, but that now had some, took on some objective seeming approach. And conservatives now, the sophisticated conservatives now say, oh, we don't care about activism or passivism. We used to care, or people in a prior generation, conservatives, cared about activism. We don't. We care about enforcing the original meaning. Sometimes that means upholding legislation that that we like. Sometimes it means striking down legislation. So we are activists when we strike down legislation, but that's okay because we're doing it in the name of the original understanding.
And one of the things that really worries me, especially when it comes to, I'd say, Alito and Thomas, and perhaps I might be wrong with this, but they seem to be the most strident in this type of activist streak. I would say cruel streak. I would say right wing streak. Is the focus on Brown versus Board of Education. Can you tell me why that case is so pivotal to the modern conservative movement and to weaken it?
Well, so the answer is uh, it's a decision by the Earl Warren Court, by Earl Warren. The Warren Court is the evil genius behind all the bad things that have happened since 1954. But it the decision in Brown is unequivocally the most strongly endorsed decision by the American people of the past 80, 90 years. It's a decision that is unequivocally, from the point of view of people today, unequivocally correct. So what conservatives have to do is figure out a way of explaining why Brown against Board of Education is somehow consistent with their theory of constitutional interpretation.
And for those who don't know, that's the historic case that essentially ended segregation in public schools.
Right, right, and it was a foundation for the increasing civic recognition of Black people and more generally racial minorities in the country. And for all the language about DEI being bad, nobody today thinks that, no, nobody is an overstatement, but
Most.
enormous majorities
Yeah.
think that civic inclusion of the sort that was triggered by Brown is a morally attractive feature of the US constitutional system. So you got to figure out some way to defend Brown against Board of Education.
But why is Thomas in particular so unnerved by it?
Uh, well, yeah, Justice Thomas is, I think, sort of an interesting figure. There's a very good book by Corey Rahman, political scientist, about Justice Thomas. And Justice Thomas, Robin says, I wrote briefly about it earlier, that Justice Thomas is in a certain tradition of Black nationalism, in which Black nationalists position themselves as defenders of Black pride against deprecation by white elites. And Justice Thomas sees things like affirmative action as that kind of deprecation. You can't, he sees it in this way, you can't make it on your own. You need our white people's help. And as a Black nationalist, he thinks of that variant, he takes offense at that, and in some ways, properly so. Now, he's got a very peculiar version of Black nationalism.
Very peculiar.
But there is a tradition of Black thought within which he's actually located.
And he also happens to be married to Ginny Thomas. And I was going to say there's also a Christian nationalist strand. Can you talk about this new conservative Supreme Court? Which, look, Scalia, his opinions, he was outright strident, passionate conservative. But this is a new strand of conservatism where you have you have Alito's wife, who flies not just one but two flags associated with the January 6th insurrection, right? At two different properties. You have Justice Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, who texts Mark Meadows, then chief of staff under Trump, supportive comments during the insurrection. And then you have this whopper of a case in the summer where it's the most expansive type of understanding of the executive power, where the conservative majority in the Supreme Court gives Donald Trump, essentially, let's just be honest, Donald Trump, quote, absolute immunity for core functions. You've been following the Supreme Court for so many years. Is this particular brand of conservatism that's in right now? I mean, is it safe to say this is an extreme Christian nationalism?
I'm not sure. I would say that. I wouldn't,
Okay.
just because it's not the way I talk, but I understand the account of it. I don't think so there is a powerful strand of Christian nationalism in the MAGA movement. There's no question about that. I'm not sure that the court is fairly characterized as signing on to that fully. There's a case pending before the court now involving public funding for religious schools, where we'll see what they have to say about it. And they're likely to, move more in the direction of public support of religion, meaning Christian religion. They haven't yet confronted, the doctrinal implications. If you do this for Christian schools, you got to do it for Muslim schools, and they really, don't want to do that. But so they haven't worked it out. I think what's most striking, actually, is that you have this, I call it MAGA constitutional jurisprudence, being endorsed by Clarence Thomas, who was appointed in 1991, 92, well before the MAGA movement, and Samuel Alito, nominated in the early 2000s, again before MAGA. They're the most strident supporters of MAGA, and yet their conservatism was they were conservatives of a before MAGA existed. They were
Mm,
MAGA conservatives before MAGA existed, or maybe, they were just waiting for MAGA to come along to liberate what their
mm.
true conservative feelings were. And I find that an interesting phenomenon as an observer of the court.
And then there's also Justice Barrett, and I'm sure you've been following that MAGA. She was a MAGA darling, but they've turned on her as of last week because she joined with Roberts in the Liberals, right, in this decision, telling the Trump administration that they have to release these funds, these $2 billion that were given by Congress to foreign organizations. In the past week, just this the type of vicious whiplash against Barrett. Talk to us about Barrett and how she might actually be an oddball here on this court.
Yeah, so I have a snippet about Justice Barrett in my book, which I have a footnote saying, my friends on the left probably don't have the same view of her. I find her, so what I find interesting about her is not that she's a Trump appointee, and nobody should think that because you're nominated by a particular president, you're in the pocket of that president on every issue that matters to him. It just things just don't work that way. Uh, you're nominated by a president. Actually, the three nominees that Trump were named were all off of a list developed by the Federalist Society,
Yeah.
and he had to pick from that list because he was politically constrained at the time. He had to satisfy them. It was an important constituency. Um, but they're not uniformly, oh, if Trump says it, it must be okay kinds of people. Uh, um, and I think what's actually most interesting about Justice Barrett is her involvement with this conservative Catholic group called the People of Faith,
Yeah.
which I think has likely exposed her to, as I put it, a wider range of human experience than John Roberts has been exposed to. John Roberts is a standard upper class lawyer who circulates in standard upper class circles. Justice Barrett, with this People of Faith stuff, deals with a whole bunch of very different kinds of people. And I don't know how that plays out in particular decisions, but it's gives her a wider view of life than Chief Justice Roberts had.
Were you surprised by her and Roberts and what they decided last week?
Oh, I'm a little surprised, but these are messy technical issues, and I think you could fairly go with Trump on them or against Trump on them, taking a sort of disinterested view of the law. People like me always says to understand this, you really have to get into the weeds, and you know, lay people, non-specialists, don't really need to understand the weeds. But when you get into the weeds of this case, it gets complicated, and you could come out either way.
Do you feel, because I'm sure, as a person who's been studying the Supreme Court, you've seen also the polls. I mean, an immense lack of trust now in the Supreme Court, seen as an arm of the MAGA movement, seen as, unilaterally dismantling some of the rights that we've, acquired through hard work over the past 80 years. Well, how do you get the trust back? Or do you feel like as an institution, this is just now just flawed and corrupt?
So it's not, from my point of view, it's not clear that I want the court to be trusted any further. And that's, I started my academic career in the 1970s, and I've been skeptical about the court for the whole fine. So now, the rest of the country is caught up with me is sort of the way not the whole rest of it. Many people in the country have caught up with me. So if people don't trust the court, that's actually a good thing from my point of view. And we ought to, I think, be very skeptical about them, no matter who they are. Now, as it happens, you do the sort of statistical studies that political science has done. I want to stress this is not something that for me justifies the skepticism, but if you look at likely composition of the court with the way politics operates, chances are that there'll be a solid conservative majority on the court for at least 20 years, probably 30 years.
Wow.
And if Trump gets another appointment or two, as he might, maybe 40 years. And that, so from a political point of view, I'm not a conservative. I want people not to trust the court, but from the point of view of somebody who thinks, how should we organize our government? We ought to govern ourselves and not, shift some responsibility off onto the courts. And so we ought to be skeptical of what they do, even if they were liberal. I want to say, even if they were liberal.
I approve. You should always be skeptical of those in power and hold them to account and keep pushing them and make sure that they don't abuse their power. A question I have for you, a final question, is I was reading that it was a Guardian article where you're predicting, or you wouldn't be surprised if there is a vacancy. And again, there might be. Alito's not a young buck. Thomas isn't that young. Sotomayor is having some health issues. You're saying that a host, could be a next Supreme Court justice. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I want to make it clear that was partly in jest, but only partly. And I don't think it's a high probability thing. But President Trump is a special kind of politician. And he has a view about how to build his political support, and to the extent that he cares, how to build MAGA in general. And part of that view is doing things that are striking and surprising and outside the box. So the Fox News point was explicitly about Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, but also Sean Duffy as Secretary of Transportation. These are people who look good on TV.
Yep, Hegseth. Yep.
And so you might think that he'll move in that direction in nominating a Supreme Court justice. I actually now, because of development since that interview and since I wrote the book, I'd say of the outside the box nominee, the name I would come up with is Émile Beauvais, who has this cadaverous look, which might be attractive to President Trump, but also is personally loyal.
So, loyalist who's good on TV, qualifications be damned. What could go wrong, Professor? What could go wrong? Actually, one more question. I'm going to real quick. Do you have, and of course, looking at a crystal ball, you don't know, I don't know, but you know these personalities far better than most people. You've studied them. I believe, this is just me speaking, that this administration, this particular Trump administration, is taking this country towards a type of authoritarianism that we haven't seen, where this administration, and especially the people who are in almost a cultish embrace of it, are now more aligned with Russia than they are with the U.S. The FT, Financial Times, did a fascinating breakdown, which said that the U.S. right now is more aligned with Turkey and Russia, right? A praise of Orban of Hungary, a praise of Netanyahu, a praise of Putin. But we have some checks and balances. Republicans have the House and Senate. It seems that they've completely abdicated that. So we have the Supreme Court. Do you believe this Supreme Court, whether it's Roberts or Barrett, will be a check if indeed he does spiral further and further towards authoritarianism?
So the line I use has been used by students of authoritarian transformations of democracies. I don't. The courts are not going to be our savior.
Mm,
Uh, they may. I think they're likely to put what scholars call speed bumps in the way of slowing down the transformation. And yeah, speed bumps, slowing things down may be helpful if the opposition, because it gives the opposition time to get its act together
mm.
and time for external events to come into play. If there's a recession, 6 months from now, the political position of the Republicans will be weaker. If the court has slowed the transformation down, then the political opposition may be able to thwart the moves that the administration, I think, does want to make.
It's scary territory, sir. It's scary territory. I thank you for coming on and breaking it down for me and for those who aren't constitutional scholars, and giving some nuance. I hope. Listen, I was pleasantly surprised by that 5-4 decision. Maybe it's Barrett and Roberts. Who would have thought? Who'd come in and keep us off the brink? But seeing what they've done so far, I don't know. But it is up to the people, and it's up to the people to do what we can to resist these dangerous forces. You are a Harvard law professor. You have a new book out called Who Am I to Judge? Judicial Craft versus Constitutional Theory, where you break down some of the topics we discussed today in more detail. And please, before I let you go, Professor Tushnet, shamelessly promote yourself. How can people support you, find you, read you?
So, well, go to standard sources for your books. It's published by the Yale University Press. I'm these days not really enthusiastic about promoting Amazon, but you can buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And I have an account on Blue Sky.
What's your account?
I think it's Mark Tushnet at Blue Sky, something like that.
Well,
Just look for my name on Blue Sky.
I'll link to it in the write up.
Okay.
Thanks all for watching. This has been another episode of Chai Talk with Wajat Lee for the Left Hook Substack. As always, take care of yourself, stay safe, stay sane, stay sober, and please, oh please, don't be a fascist. Take care.